Hello and welcome to Newsclick featuring the budget 2010-11. The Finance Minister Pranab Mukherjee's budget for the year 2010 and 11 has been criticized by the opposition to betray a pro-rich bias. Newsclick.in examines some of the key features of the budget.
I am happy to report that in keeping with my commitment, I have been able to present the budget for 2010-11 with a fiscal deficit of 5.5%. In the medium-term fiscal policy statement being presented to the House today, along with other budget documents, the rolling targets for the fiscal deficit are pegged at 4.8% and 4.1% for 2011-12 and 2012-13 respectively. The improvement in our economic performance encourages a course of fiscal correction even as the global situation warrants caution.
Even as the economies across the world are trying to overcome the present economic crisis through expansionary fiscal measures termed Keynesian policies, our finance minister is on the contrary arguing for a contractionary fiscal policy. As the critics of fiscal conservatism would argue, a decline in fiscal deficit in the presence of unutilized resources leads to a decline in growth. It is ironic that Pranab Mukherjee is saying this at a time when even the most ardent critics of Keynes are arguing in favor of his policies. It would be imprudent to believe that the crisis is over and that India would be back on a high growth path and that this is the time to roll back the stimulus packages. Moreover, the government's effort to continue the stimulus through tax concessions to the corporate sector and the rich does not have a sound economic justification. One can argue convincingly that tax concession to the rich does not automatically stimulate demand, since the rich might decide not to spend the extra amount that they receive, especially when the economy is on a downhill and the investment climate is uncertain. On the other hand, stimulus through government expenditure has a direct effect on stimulating demand and thereby on economic growth.
My proposal on the direct taxations are estimated to result in a revenue loss of rupees 26,000 crore. In view of the pressing need to move back to the fiscal consolidation path, I propose to restore the basic duty of 5% on crude petroleum, 7.5% on diesel and petrol, and 10% on the other refined products. I also propose to enhance the central excise duty on petrol and diesel by ₹1 per litre.
In tune with the pro-rich economic policy, the government has concentrated on the indirect taxes for resource mobilization. An increase in indirect taxes means an increase in the price of all the goods. Such a strategy of resource mobilization is intrinsically anti-poor, since their consumption basket would become expensive even as their income remains stagnant or worse still declines. It is clear that the poor are being made to pay through their nose when they are losing employment opportunities as a result of the crisis. Therefore, the consequence of this budgetary measure is a double squeeze on the poor and the lower middle class of the Indian population. How is this budget inflationary?
Well, if you look at the current inflationary situation, the inflation is primarily inflation in food prices, which of course hits every segment of the population and particularly the poor, whose major expenditure is on food. Now, the budget is inflationary in terms of specifically measures it takes which will fuel further increases in food prices, and it is also inflationary in terms of what it indicates might happen in the future. In terms of what it specifically does, the major impact on food prices will of course be the increases in excise duty on petroleum products, because that affects transport costs. So it will impact on every price, and of course food prices, which are already rising rapidly, will be majorly affected by this. So that is the immediate inflationary impact. But the budget is also indicated by what has been earmarked for petroleum subsidy, that oil prices themselves may of course go up in the future. The present measure is a revenue measure. It brings money to the government, not to the oil companies. There might be in the future also, the indication is, an increase in prices to generate more revenues for the oil companies, which will add to the already existing impact. So not only the increase in oil prices presently, but the possible increase in food prices in the coming days will add to the inflationary pressures. And given that it's a price inflation primarily. The decision, what has been budgeted in for food and fertilizer subsidies also indicates that the government is not going to use subsidies as a means of checking this inflation. They have budgeted for actually a cut in food and fertilizer subsidies. So every set of measures they have taken seems to go against addressing the specific inflation that you have today, which is primarily a food price inflation.
While presenting the budget for 2009-10, I invited people to participate in government's disinvestment program to share in the wealth and prosperity of the central public sector undertakings. The government will raise about Rs 25,000 crore during the current year.
It is astounding to see the finance minister rolling out the red carpet so unabashedly for big business and corporate houses to take over key public assets. Even on the expenditure side, this budget's proposals are disappointing.
The agriculture sector occupies center stage in our resolve to promote inclusive growth, enhance rural income, and sustain food security.
There has been a substantial decline in the share of agriculture and allied activities from the total union budget as well as from the GDP compared to the allocations in budget 2009. Even as the food prices are increasing exorbitantly, union budget outlay for food subsidy has been reduced from Rs 56,000 crores in 2009-10 to 55,578 crores in 2010-11. This is to be seen in the context of the election manifesto of the Congress promising enactment of a National Food Security Act by 2012.
The effective management of the public expenditure by bringing it in line with the government's objective is a part of the fiscal consolidation process. This calls for proper targeting of subsidies and expenditure adjustment.
It is alarming to see that despite a negative growth rate in agriculture, the government has proposed to decrease the allocation on fertilizer subsidies, which will put downward pressure on the incomes of the farmers. There is a paltry increase of Rs 5,000 crores for primary education as opposed to the annual requirement of Rs 34,600 crores to implement the Right to Education Act as per the HRD Ministry's own estimates. Despite the increase in incidence on TB, malaria and other communicable diseases, there is actually a decline in the allocation of resources on National Disease Control Program. There is also a decline in allocation to the premier institutes of medical education like PGIMER, Chandigarh.
At the current moment, the economy faced three major challenges which the budget should have been directed towards addressing. Number one was the demand slowdown, which is a result of the interaction of the global economic crisis with domestic economic conditions. Demand slowdown, because there is no evidence as yet that without fiscal support the demand process expansion will be adequate. Number two was the fact that the demand slowdown and the growth slowdown accentuated the already existing problem of our growth process not being inclusive enough, to use a shorthand expression. So it was not inclusive when the growth was very high, it becomes even less inclusive when the growth slows down. That was the second challenge, addressing that problem. The third major challenge was, of course, the food price inflation. All these three challenges, to be effectively met, required a commitment on the part of the government to expand public expenditure, which is precisely what the government has not done. On the revenue side, the revenues should have been mobilized to the maximum possible extent with the idea of financing expenditures required for this, not necessarily with the idea of cutting down the fiscal deficit or fiscal consolidation as is the preoccupation of the government. So on the revenue side, however, you do not see measures which either reflect an intent towards generating resources for expenditure nor an intent to address the inequities of our society, which is indicated by the fact that you've increased the taxes on petroleum products, which is a tax on the entire population, and simultaneously you have given a tax concession, indirect taxes to the rich. You have not been willing to mobilize resources from corporate taxes, even though corporate profits have become a very large share of the total income generated in the economy. So neither the problem of demand, nor the problem of inflation, nor the problem of lack of inclusiveness, neither of these problems have been properly addressed, precisely because increase in expenditure they have not been willing to do. On the other side, on the revenue side, they've been willing to take measures which are actually going to exaggerate or exacerbate some of these problems. For example, the problem of inflation, which is bound to get intensified as a result of the increase in petroleum tax.
As soon as the finance minister announced his decision to restore the excise duty on petrol and petroleum products, etc., the entire opposition staged an unprecedented walkout as a mark of protest. It is clear that despite all the promises of touching and improving the lives of the Aam Aadmi, the UPA government has used this budget to woo the large corporations and the rich at the cost of the poor. To put it in a nutshell, this budget does not address the pressing issues of the day and only exacerbates inequality.